What if the story of the fiery furnace and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego isn't about just having enough faith in order to get what you want, but it's actually a story about having faith that's bigger than the problems of the moment? I'm Pastor Nate. This is another episode of the Sunday School Remix podcast. Today we're talking about, the story of the fiery furnace. You can find it in Daniel chapter 3. Here we go. Welcome to the Sunday School Remix, the show where we take Bible stories you learned as a kid and look at them with fresh eyes. Each week, we dig into the context and the overlooked details, and we often discover interpretations we never heard growing up. This isn't about winning arguments, but simply hearing God's living word speak to our lives again today. So grab your Bible and put aside your assumptions, and let's dive into another episode of the Sunday School Remix. So this is another Sunday school story that, when you zoom out and really think about what's going on here, seems kind of inappropriate for children. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how one day their king, King Nebuchadnezzar, who is the Babylonian king, he builds a huge statue and he says, hey, everybody's got to bow down and worship. And these three men decide not to. And they're thrown in a fiery furnace and they survive. And that's why we put this as a Sunday school story. They survived the fiery furnace. But there is so much more here and so much political information going on that we just do not cover, rightfully so, in any sort of Sunday school class. Let's back up a little bit. So this is a story about Israelites during the Babylonian exile. They have been captured and defeated by the Babylonians and now are living in a foreign land. And so they're almost like slaves again. I guess it kind of depends on a lot of the details, but a way when you look at the meta-narrative of Scripture to think about it is that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. God freed them and brought them to the Promised Land. They prospered as this great nation of Israel under David and then even more so under Solomon, but then they forgot who they were and who God called them to be, and eventually they were led into exile. And there's actually two different exiles. We aren't going to get into all of that. But when they go to exile, it's interesting from a narrative perspective about how the experience of exile is very similar to their experience when they were slaves in Egypt. Not exactly the same, but there was so much about their experience at that time that cut them off from their core sense of identity and connection to God. Just briefly on that point, when you're in Israel, when they were living in Israel, there was the temple there, and that was the place for specific festivals and religious rites. And so when you're in exile, you can't worship God in the ways that you would most want to. I guess that's the best way to put it. There's a piece of their religious life that they're cut off from, in addition to being cut off from family and friends and their home areas that they know and love. And so I just say that to help us understand how traumatic and difficult exile must have been. And so the story in Daniel chapter 3 is about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are Jewish exiles living in Babylon. In fact, in Daniel chapter 1, it tells us that these three men, it mentions some other people as well, but these three men, their real names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I hope I said those correctly. So these are their Hebrew names. But because they've been captured and moved to Babylon, they've had their names changed. Their names they're now known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But that's a Babylonian type of moniker. So even their names are not their own in exile. But we hear this story now. Nebuchadnezzar wants to really help people know who's in control and who's in power. And so he sets up this system. He builds this statue, this golden statue that's 90 feet tall. And it's funny because in Daniel chapter 3, there's this weird line where Daniel's like, you will build only the head or something like that. And Nebuchadnezzar builds an entire statue of himself. It's sort of, scholars think that Daniel was trying to keep the king in his place And Nebuchadnezzar's like, nah, we're not doing that. I'm the best. Check out this golden statue of me. So he builds a statue, and then, and that's for intimidation purposes. It's for people to see this example of wealth and the power that it takes to have something like that constructed, especially at those times. This is an impressive feat, and that's what Nebuchadnezzar wants to communicate. Look how great I am. And then he takes it a step further, and he says, like, nope, and when you hear the music play, it's like musical chairs. When you hear the music play, everyone must bow down and worship. And it even tells us that specifically all nations and peoples of all languages, like it's not just a command for a small group of people. Nebuchadnezzar wants everyone to do this. And what this story is really helping paint the picture of is the fragility of King Nebuchadnezzar and his hubris, his ego, and his need to feel in control and to be the one seen as almost someone to be feared, the one who has the power. And it's neat how the story is told because it's repetitive in really annoying ways, where it lists again and again all of the people who are involved. And then it lists all of the instruments that are played at the sound. And then it lists that, yes, this call to prayer happened and everyone had to stop and bow down and worship the golden statue. And the repetition, scholars say, helps us see this almost as a satirical portrayal of King Nebuchadnezzar. He is so fragile that he has to go through all of this machinery and mechanisms in order to get people to acknowledge his power and control, in order to have his ego boosted here. And yet, despite all of this machinery and all of the different people and all of the different instruments and all of these calls to prayer, besides these lists that repeat and repeat within the text itself, but despite all of that, Nebuchadnezzar still can't control 3 Jewish exiles named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he is so mad about this. It says that he's enraged and his face changes, which is neat of he's changed by this process, but in a bad way. And he becomes so angry. And he told people, if you don't bow down, I'm throwing you in the furnace. And he's so angry that he actually heats the furnace up 7 times hotter than it's supposed to be. And in that rage, it actually tells us that the furnace kills the guards standing there. It's so hot that they're just in proximity to the furnace and they burn up. So his rage destroys his people, his minions as a result. And so there's some real clever commentary in this story about, the ways that our ego and our hubris and our rage can affect those around us in negative ways. And the ways that it's just so foolish in light of the fact that there is an all-powerful God who is always above and beyond us, always more capable than us. That is the one true God who Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worship. I want to back up, though, because before they turn up the furnace, there's this conversation between the king and the 3 men. And what they say to them is that they tell him very clearly in verse 15. In verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar asks the question that really illustrates the overall point. He says, "What God will save you from me?" And that's the hypothetical question that the story is answering very clearly. Nebuchadnezzar thinks of himself as God. He thinks that he's the one with all the power and all the control, and that no one could possibly tell him no or stand up to him. Who's going to save you? And the beautiful portrayal of faith that we get from the 3 Jewish exiles is they tell him in the next verses that our God will deliver us. They have confidence in this. But then they say, but even if he does not, we still want you to know that we will not serve other gods. And this is the crux of the story in my mind. We might think of this, and I'm sure this story gets used in Sunday school and other places, as a story about how, hey, if you just have enough faith, you can be saved from the fires of the furnace. And again, it becomes transactional. We love transactional thinking. I feel like I've talked about that a lot in these podcast episodes. We love to think that, like, if I just do this, then God will reward me. But actually, that's not what faith is about. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego show us, like, faith is a trust and a deep loyalty that goes beyond this reality, that goes beyond this present moment. We believe that God will deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we want you to know, Nebuchadnezzar, that we will not serve other gods. We want you to know that your ego doesn't scare us, that your need for control doesn't affect us. We are trusting in a promise that's so much bigger than your fragile attempt to be a god on earth. That's what they're saying to Nebuchadnezzar. That's why he gets so mad, because people in those positions don't like to be told no, and he's one of them. But zoom out for a second and think about what that means for our life too. We don't go to church so that God will reward us and give us a promotion or a raise or a good parking spot. Like, we go to church, we worship, we practice our faith because it connects us with a promise that's always bigger than this reality. It connects us with a God who's so much more than any one person here on earth today. And that reframing of our mindset makes all of these attempts of control so powerless. Nebuchadnezzar cannot control these three men, despite all of the leaders and all of the different instruments that play, right? Despite all of that repetition and machinery that he's trying to put into place, he can't control the three Jewish exiles because they put their trust in a promise that's bigger than this reality. And so, this system that he's built that's all about control, it's not working. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they choose not to bow down because they know who they belong to. Even though their names have been changed, right? That level of disconnect from their identity. And still, there's something about faith that provides us with a sense of belonging that's so much more enduring. Putting our faith in something so much bigger than even our names. Do you see how cool this story is when you dig into the details and what it's really trying to say? And it goes, there's a little addendum at the end too that I think is really powerful to reflect on. Because what happens is that they go into the furnace, right? Even though, like, the guards are burned up by this 7 times heated furnace, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they go in bound. And then people are looking in the furnace and they notice that there's 4 figures in the furnace, and all of them are unbound and not being burned up. And this has a real theological bent to it, in that the figure of God, this 4th angelic figure, shows up in the midst of the violence, what should have been a terribly violent, horrific act on the part of Nebuchadnezzar. That's where God shows up. God shows up in the very climactic moment of the story where it feels like all hope was lost, right? It seems like God would have intervened before then. But again, that for the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's not what it was about. Even if God doesn't show up, we want you to know, Nebuchadnezzar, that we will not serve other gods. And God shows up in the furnace. And that's the message of our Christian faith again and again. Jesus shows up on the cross. Or Jesus shows up as a little baby, right? The most vulnerable type of circumstance, or the most horrific type of circumstance in the crucifixion. Those are the places where God will meet us. Those are the places where God is with us, promises to be with us. And so they are taken out of the furnace, and King Nebuchadnezzar is like, oh, like, my bad. And then it's clear that he hasn't fully learned his lesson. Because what he does is he tells them that he's going to make a new rule. And anyone who doesn't worship their God will be, like, cut up, I think it is. It's a very violent type of punishment. It's not a furnace, but it's another very violent punishment. And it's clear that this is the way he is, that he's going to keep insisting upon violence. And that's part of the message of the story too, is that so often empire and kings and rulers can be so preoccupied with using violence as a tool. And what the story shows us is this is where what God wants to try and prevent. God tries to step in the most violent moment to save these people. That's not part of God's plan. And yet this is so hard for our rulers to learn. And really, when we put this in a personal level, we need to stop and reflect and think about all the ways that we're like King Nebuchadnezzar, where we have a very narrow view in mind of how things are supposed to be. Well, if you're going to take that viewpoint, I have nothing more to say to you. Well, if you can't get with the program, then we're done here. We make these ultimatums, and those are acts of violence too. We're trying to just insist upon our own control in our own way, rather than working with the other person to come to a more perfect whole in all of this. So anyways, there's a lot in here, as you can see. And it has such a political dimension to it, because it is this stark critique of Babylon that the authors are also sharing, and their ways. But in the same sense, what it was also doing at the time was providing Israel with their own sense of reflection. Hey, when did we act like that? Maybe we didn't force people to bow down and worship us, but we were so concentrated on our own way of doing things that we forgot what God hopes for, right? The Israelite kingdom used violence in order to accomplish their means, and I don't think that was what God wanted. And as you look at what the prophets had to say to the kings of Israel during that time of exile, they were really critical about the way that Israel had been showing up. And this story is just another example of that. It's an example to them of how God will be with them, even in something as difficult as exile. But it's also a story of asking them to self-reflect. And it can be the same story for us too. God is with you in the fires. And our calling is not to just control everyone around us and make them all think like we do. And our faith is built on a promise that's connected to a deeper reality than this current moment. And somehow all those fit together and share in this care of us on this confusing journey of life, this confusing journey of faith we find ourselves in. All right, there's a ton of thoughts on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I hope that was interesting, helpful, and hopefully not too confusing, because there's a lot of pieces and threads to it. But I'm Pastor Nate. Thanks so much for listening and watching. Feel free to share this with people who might be interested in learning more about Daniel chapter 3. And remember, the story didn't end at Sunday school. Thanks for listening to another episode of Sunday School Remix. If you'd like more resources for your walk of faith, feel free to check out my church's website, bethany-denver.org, or you can download our mobile app by searching Bethany Connect in your phone's app store.